The Prime Minister, Mark Carney, will meet with the American President Donald Trump in Washington tomorrow. Many issues, of course, on the table, tariffs and a trade deal being the key ones. Let's bring in John Weeks, member of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. He was formerly Canada's chief negotiator for NAFTA and ambassador to the WTO. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Marilla.
The tariffs on steel and aluminum, I'm sure top of mind for the Prime Minister. Should we be at all optimistic that some relief can be worked out?
Well, I think that's hard to say. And, because, of course, in the United States, it would seem that decisions definitely are made at the top. There's no way of really knowing the answer to that question without actually sitting down and having someone talk to the president. So I think whether or not there's a deal to be had, I think the meeting tomorrow will be valuable because it will allow the Prime Minister to make Canada's case to the only person whose decision really matters.
Do you see the tariffs as bargaining chips for CUSMA?
No. I think I think the current jockeying of position on these tariffs on individual sectors is taking place sort of against the backdrop of the beginning of the consultation process domestically in the three NAFTA countries for the so-called review of the CUSMA. And of course, the CUSMA could be just reviewed and the parties decide to extend it for a further 16 years, or it could go into a process of considering various proposals for how it could be improved. And that would obviously lead to a negotiation.
Okay, so what is it that you think Washington wants from Canada during the process of negotiation?
Well, I think, we'll have a much better idea of what that is when we see what comes out of the consultation process. And to a large extent, that consultation process will be quite public. I believe the submissions that various parties make in the United States to the American government have to be public. And then there will be public hearings at which people will have an opportunity to amplify on what they've already submitted. There are other documents that are out there. The USTR does an annual survey of foreign barriers to trade of American exports. And that's a very good starting point for trying to get a better understanding of what is it the Americans will be after. And some of those things are going to be, things that won't come as any surprise at all. They'll be complaining about our supply management policies. They'll be complaining about our digital services tax. They'll be complaining about ownership rules in certain sectors that they're interested in. But how they will zero in on all of that is, we'll have to wait and see as the situation evolves.
Is there any genuine worry that the U.S. could choose to leave CUSMA?
Well, Donald Trump has threatened to in the past, although, of course, this is now his agreement. It's one that he negotiated in his first term. And I think what's instructive here is that despite all the tariffs that the U.S. has imposed, the so-called fentanyl and border tariffs, which were set at 25% at the beginning of March, and then increased on August 1st to 35%. What is really important, I think, is to note that while it looked like those tariffs were going to apply originally to the majority of Canadian exports, the latest figure I heard is that 97% of Canadian exports to the United States have been determined to be so-called CUSMA compliant. So these Canadian exports qualify for the rules of origin under the CUSMA, and therefore the tariff on them is zero. So the 35% tariff only applies to about 3% of Canadian exports. Now, the fact that the United States is respecting the provisions of the USMCA in terms of the duty-free treatment of Canadian exports, I think is a good sign that the United States values the agreement and wants it to continue. Yeah. And of course, this has formed part of an earlier discussion between the Prime Minister and the President, where the Prime Minister agreed to suspend Canadian duties, most of our retaliatory duties that weren't related to specific sectors, and I think that shows that there's a good chance that this agreement is going to continue. It also, incidentally, puts Canada and Mexico in a much better position than any other foreign countries with respect to their access to the U.S. market. Other countries have negotiated recent deals with Donald Trump, but but those are deals with agreements that aren't really secure in any sort of legal sense, and also there are duties that are applied under those agreements. Some of them reasonably high, up to 25% or higher, 15% for the EU. So we're 0 and the EU's at 15. That's not bad.
It's not bad until you realize that at any point Donald Trump can and will implement tariffs on certain sectors, right? So last week it was cabinetry now coming into the U.S. is going to have a duty on it. He's already looking at pharmaceutical markups, copper we know of. So there's a certain amount that does pass duty free until the next month or the next week. How easy or difficult is it to negotiate under this kind of umbrella where really the president decides on any given day how he wants to treat the trading partners?
Well, I must say I'm glad that I practiced trade policy in an era in which things were a bit more predictable. So yes, you've put your finger on the big problem. Nobody knows exactly what Donald Trump is going to do tomorrow. These duties under the so-called Section 232, really basically for so-called national security purposes, and that tool seems to be being expanded. It could be, of course, that with respect to the broader swath of duties under the fentanyl and so-called border tariffs, that there's a case moving that will be heard by the hearings by the Supreme Court starting the beginning of November, which could determine that those tariffs are unconstitutional. Okay,
so we could see some relief, but it's not really clear.
No, and I think in terms of the so obviously I think the focus of the Prime Minister is going to be on these sectoral duties, trying to make some progress on that front, and whether that's possible or not in the run-up to the review of the CUSMA, I think is uncertain.
Just last quick question here. Do you see Mexico as an ally in these negotiations with Canada, or do you think Mexico will have its own difficulties trying to sort out what it needs to sort out with the U.S. to ally with Canada?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. So on the one hand, Canada and the U.S. will be united on wanting to see the continuance of a strong CUSMA agreement that provides predictability for trade in North America. On the other hand, clearly we've got a number of different interests from Mexico, and we'll be clearly defending our own interests at the negotiating table.
Okay. John Weeks, I do have to leave it there with you. Appreciate your time joining us on The Close. Thank you, sir.